Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we'll be covering something a whole lot lighter than what we've been covering for the last 2 weeks. The David Parker Ray case is always super hard to talk about, but I also think it's important to talk about cases like that because whether we all want to believe it or not, things like that are still happening as we live and breathe, as we go on about our lives in complete oblivion. So this week we're covering something that's a lot lighter and it's not murdery at all. Just a little creepy. Actually, it's creepy as hell. This week we're going to get into the folklore of the Black-Eyed Kids. Ooh, spooky. So these black-eyed kids have been seen in multiple parts of the world, and everybody who encounters a black-eyed kid has basically said the same thing. That they are completely terrifying, and that their eyes are solid black, and that their skin's extremely pale in color, but almost like it's too pale. They aren't called the black-eyed kids for no reason. There's also, there's no white parts of their eyes showing. There's also not like a blue, brown, or green color to their eyes at all, where most people's are a color. The entire part of the eye that you can see is completely solid jet black. The black-eyed kids look and even act like regular kids. Well, kinda. And you'll see what I mean by kinda when we get into some of the encounters that people have had with black-eyed kids, because most of the time, black-eyed kids are either dressed in clothes that seem to be just out of date enough to be something that you would notice, like they're dressed just enough out of date for you to be like, that's different, or they're dressed right on the money with whatever's the newest trends are, like there's no in-between. Black-eyed kids also seem to kind of alter your subconscious in some sort of way. So many people report feeling scared or dreadful or having like an overwhelming sense of doom surrounding their experience with black-eyed kids. But in some ways still, the people that have experienced them have felt like they needed to help them in whatever way that they could. But I wonder, is it because they present themselves as children? Because who doesn't feel the need to help a kid? Or is there another reason that we'll probably never be able to explain? People say that the manner in which black-eyed kids speak is like they know the English language, but in a super off-putting way. They don't speak in the way that most English-speaking people would normally speak. And not like the same way that someone would speak who speaks broken English. But like they say things that almost make sense. And then in the next part of the sentence, it just doesn't make as much sense with some of the other things that they've already said at the beginning of the conversation. And I'll give you some examples of this, the way they speak and carry themselves once we get into some of the experiences that people have had with black-eyed kids. So that should make it a little easier to understand what I mean. So what are black-eyed kids? Well, supposedly they're some sort of supernatural being that looks like normal, everyday people, but not just people. They look like children. They all look to be between the ages of 6 and 16, and they usually stop somebody either by knocking on their door, stopping in your car, tapping on your window, and they always seem to be asking for permission for something. So they either need to be let inside your house, let inside your car, basically wherever you are, they need to be in a close personal proximity to you, but they need your permission to do so. And as far as permission goes, it almost seems like from everything that I've read and researched that they have to have your permission in order to enter your home or car, etc., whatever. Like they can't just come in unless you say that they can come in. So as if I wasn't already suspicious enough of literally everybody, now I'm just going to be telling any random kid that stops me and asks for a ride or to come inside my house for something, no. Absolutely not. Go find your parents. That's going to be a hard pass for me, especially after researching black-eyed kids. I'm telling every kid no. No, 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 no. Hell no. Black-eyed kids are also known for wearing hoods over their heads to try to hide their eyes. And they do things like grow their hair out and wear it over their faces, kind of like we all did in 8th grade, if you know, you know. And they do this to keep their eyes concealed. Most sightings of the black-eyed kids have been of more than just one kid. It's usually at least 2, but sometimes 3. So they use the buddy system, so that's good, I guess. And since there are normally at least 2 of them, there's one that's always generally a good bit older than the other one. But like I said, since there is always two, the older of the two is usually the one that does the talking, and the younger of the two just kind of stands there and stares at the ground, because that isn't creepy at all. The first sighting and encounter with a black-eyed kid was kind of like a viral thing before going viral was a thing. And it was back in the 90s when you couldn't use your house phone if somebody was on the home computer, and you had to put disk in your computer to have the slowest internet on God's green earth. So back in the mid-90s, a man typed out his experience with black-eyed kids 2 years after it had actually happened to him. So he waited 2 years to even document what had happened. And I've seen this a few ways, that the man shared his experience someplace that was submitted to like a ghost hunting type of site or forum, and other sources that say that this man typed out his experience with the black-eyed kids and sent it to coworkers in an email, and that the man's coworkers leaked the email for, of course, publicity. Either way, though, the man's name was Brian Bethel, and he was a blogger before literally everybody had a blog. And Brian had experienced this encounter in 1996 while he was parked in a bank parking lot that sat across the street from a movie theater in Texas. Brian was writing a check to pay his internet bill, and he was going to use the drop box to drop his check in, and they would deposit it in the morning. His bill would be paid. And that's how that worked before online bill pay. So Brian claims that while he was in the middle of writing the check, that there was a knock on his car window that kind of snapped him out of his own little world. And when he looked up to see who was there, there were two boys standing beside his car window. One of the boys looked to be around 9 or 10 years old, and the other boy looked to be around 12 or 13 years old, and they were both wearing hoodies. You know, the pullover kind with the big pocket that fits everything. So the two boys knocked on Brian's car window, and Brian said that after he cracked his car window a little, that he immediately felt a wave of doom and dread just wash over his entire body, and that he didn't get this feeling until he looked at both of the boys standing beside his car window. And this is pretty common with people who have encountered black-eyed kids. They all claim to have felt a seriously overwhelming sense of dread, doom, fear, like all of the bad emotions just wash over their entire bodies. But this didn't really make sense to Brian. He was a grown man. They were kids. So why did he feel so much dread and fear? It didn't really make sense to him. Even in the moment, Brian says that he couldn't exactly rationalize why he was feeling the way he was feeling. And he says, quote, "I felt like I was being hunted, as if I were a prey animal." So he had the sense that he was being hunted like prey by other animals, but there was nothing there besides two kids. The two boys asked Brian to drive them to their house because they had just gotten to the movie theater and realized that they had forgotten their money back at home for the tickets. When Brian asked what movie they had planned to see, the two boys told Brian that they were wanting to go see Mortal Kombat. Brian was pretty quick on his feet because I don't think I would have thought of this. He checked the theater marquee and he checked the time on his clock in his car and realized that the movie had already been like an hour in. So it wouldn't really make sense for the boys to be worried about getting a ride all the way back to their house, then back to the theater, to basically only be able to watch the end credits of the movie. So this was already off to a pretty weird start. Brian told the boys over and over and over again that he couldn't give them a ride, and he finally just rolled his window up. Brian's instincts must have been firing at full velocity, like all cylinders were on go, because he actually had to stop himself from opening the car door to let these boys in. Even with all the fear and dread that he was feeling and the sense of doom that was overwhelming him, it was almost like his hands were moving towards the handle of the door to open it subconsciously. Like he had no intentions on opening the door, but his body was moving towards opening the door. And he said it was almost like the two boys were controlling his body movements, and he didn't even realize that he was doing it until he noticed his hand getting closer to the door. Even though his body was screaming fear, somehow his actual movements were doing otherwise, which is wild to me. But after Brian stopped himself from opening the car door, oh my God, this train comes every flipping time I record, y'all. Oh, I'm going to push through because I don't have time. So Brian finally stops himself from opening the car door, and this is when one of the boys says, "We won't hurt you. We don't have a gun." Which, what? I'm sorry, what? What did you say? Who says that? Only people that have a gun and plan to hurt you would say things like that. So, red flag number 582 at this point. They also told Brian that they just needed a ride to their mom's house and that they'd be gone before he knew it. Brian threw out a ton of different reasons as to why he couldn't take them, and he said that the older boy got more aggressive each time that Brian said no. Like, every time Brian would give another reason why he couldn't give him a ride, he could see that the boy was getting more aggressive with each time he was asking for the ride. And as he could feel this little boy getting more aggressive, that's when Brian finally saw it. He finally looked up and saw that both kids' eyes were completely solid jet black. Brian apologized, was like, "Hey, I gotta go walk my goldfish." He rolled his window back up and he drove off. So as he started to drive off, the boys looked confused, and the older boy was beating on Brian's window at this point, like yelling at him, basically telling Brian that they could only come in if he let them come in, if he gave them permission to enter his car, like they couldn't come in otherwise. Brian finally just pulled off. He tried to resist the urge to turn around and just keep his eyes focused on the road, but he couldn't really help it. When he looked back in his rearview mirror, both of the boys had seemingly vanished into thin air. They just weren't there anymore. One common denominator of all these stories is that it also seems to be something that's pretty common with people who have had experiences with black-eyed kids, is the feeling of the overwhelming sense to help these kids, of course. Who doesn't want to help a child? But that the fear and the dread is what keeps them from letting these kids into their homes or cars or, wherever they're trying to get into. But once Brian's story was out there for the general public, stories like this started popping up all across the board. So let's get into some other encounters that people have experienced with black-eyed kids over the years since Brian's experience was made public. The next encounter weirds me out for one reason and one reason alone, and I actually took this entire post from Reddit, so I didn't try to reword it or make it my own. I literally am reading straight from the Reddit post. You can find these stories online. I word for worded them because, this is their story. I'm just telling it to you. So this post on Reddit said, quote, "I recently read a story about the black-eyed kids. This story felt like a twisted tale of deja vu. I believe I've encountered black-eyed kids. I've never mentioned this particular detail about the eyes to anyone for fear that they would think I was fabricating the story or going crazy. This incident took place about 13 years ago. I had just moved to a new city with my wife. We were small-town newlyweds from the Midwest. We moved cross-country to one of the biggest cities in the Southwest so I could attend graduate school. Being naive and new to the city living, I habitually answered the door without a second thought. But never again after this. The first thing that should have tipped me off to the peculiarity of the situation was the fact that someone was knocking at 6 a.m. in the morning. The second thing that should have dawned on me is this kid had to reach over a rather tall patio gate to unlatch it and open it. The knock at the door was startling. My wife and I were getting ready for work, a pretty normal routine. The moment I opened the door, I was overtaken with an inexplicable sense of fear. To this day, I can picture him. Teenager, average height, average build, knee-length black leather coat, short black hair, and sunglasses. The sunglasses at 6 a.m. struck me as odd, and even more odd, he was eating an apple. He was very polite and asked if he could come in and warm up. I said no, closed the door, and slid the security chain into place. A moment later, another knock. I opened the now chained door, and before I could speak, he asked me again if he could come in and warm up. No, I replied, and I attempted to close the door. But before the door could shut, he put his hand out, stopping the door on its hinges. He looked directly into my eyes, still wearing his sunglasses, and said, "Can I at least get some ketchup for my apple?" "Fuck that," I replied, albeit a little confused. "Get the hell out of here. My wife is calling the police." He takes a moment to let this information sink in, lowers his glasses, revealing his eyes as black as obsidian, and said, "No, you won't be calling anybody." At that moment, I forced the door shut, locked it, and called out to my wife. She's scared shitless and hiding in the bathroom. All jacked up on adrenaline, I ripped the curtains back and looked out the window next to the door. He's gone. Absolutely no trace of him. I go out to the patio to check the gate. It's still latched from the inside. That was fucked up, I think to myself. As I turned to enter the house, I noticed a half-eaten apple laying on the ground. End quote. I'm sorry, who eats ketchup on apples? This is what I mean when I say, it's like they're trying so hard to sound and act like everyday normal kids, and then they say something super weird like, "We don't have a gun, we're not going to hurt you," or "I just need some ketchup for my apple." It almost makes me think like aliens were like, okay, well, spaceships aren't working, so let's send some that look like kids down and see how humans react. And then they program these black-eyed kids to say things that seem unalarming without any context. Like, if someone told me, I don't have a gun, I'm not going to hurt you, my first thought would literally be, oh shit, they're going to kill me and they have a gun. But if you weren't actually a human, you would think that telling someone that you won't hurt them or that you don't have a gun would ease their mind some. When in all reality, it does the exact opposite. So here's another super creepy and weird encounter. This one is also another word-for-word encounter that I found on thoughtcatalog.com. And this encounter says, quote, "It almost felt like a dream. I woke up to my dog Lucy barking. She was upright on the bed where my husband and I were sleeping with our 22-month-old daughter. Staring at our door like an unknown stranger was out there rummaging around. I thought she was just freaking out over house noises. We'd only had her for 3 months and she was still a puppy. It could have been anything. Our roommate, a creak from the house settling, the awning moving outside in the breeze. I wasn't too concerned initially. I decided the best bet would be to open the door and show her nothing was there. It sounds a bit silly, but it's what we do with our daughter when she gets scared, and I figured it should work with a puppy too. I opened the door and she raced to the front door. She stood there, snarling at the door. It was an angry, violent growl, one I had never heard her make before. I looked groggily at her and opened the baby gate blocking the doorway, planning to open the door and show her that everything was okay. The second my hand reached the deadbolt, Lucy went wild. She started barking and jumping towards me, and when I touched the metal, she suddenly changed her temper. She whimpered, almost like she was afraid and backing down. As her mannerisms changed, so did mine. I wasn't calm anymore. My heart was racing and sinking all at the same time. I had been flooded with a mixture of fear and dread. I looked through the peephole. I can't explain why I looked, but I did. And outside were 2 kids. One was just a smidgen shorter than me and didn't look much younger. I'm 22, she looked to be 16 or 17. She was slender and pale. Her hair was a light shade of honey blonde and she wore it long, about mid-back, with long, thin, blunt bangs in the front that covered most of her eyes. She wore jeans, a light wash that's popular right now, and a thin-looking olive-colored pullover-style hoodie. She held the hand of a smaller girl who looked to be around 3 or 4 in the same style jeans and a button-down ivory cardigan. The smaller one looked at the floor shyly and had the same shade of hair tied back in a ponytail. She held a stuffed toy under her free arm, and it was identical to one my daughter has, as was their style of dress. Had it not been for the feeling of overwhelming dread and fear, I probably would have asked these children in and given them some tea or hot chocolate to get them out of the bitter cold. Something about them seemed off. At this point, I hadn't made any noise. I hadn't shushed the dog or grumbled, nothing. I hadn't turned on any lights. These kids had no indicators that I was at the door. And the older one spoke. She had a voice that was mature, confident, strong, and accentless. She held her head tilted downwards, and I could not see her eyes. She said, "We have to use your phone." I stood frozen in fear. How did she know I was there? She raised her head to face me directly, and that was when I saw her eyes. They're dark purple. They were otherworldly. She said, "Our mother is worried." As someone who's always been interested in creepy stories, I knew what she was the second she looked at me through the door. I had never been one to believe in these things, as a staunch atheist and skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. I had written off many a ghost stories from friends and family members eager to tell their tale. I didn't believe it. Still, I couldn't rationalize my way out of this. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and a black-eyed kid. There was no questioning what was right in front of me. I didn't answer her. Slowly and silently, I backed away from the door, Lucy still cowering at my ankles. She kept talking. "Just let us in to use your phone." I took another step back, and with that step, the tone changed. At first, she seemed polite. When I took the second step back, she became commanding, almost hostile. "We're not going to hurt you. If we wanted to do that, we would have just broken in. I'll ask again. May we come in and use your phone?" Lucy snarled at the door, and I inched backwards, though something inside of me seemed to slowly be pulling me back towards the door. It wasn't a physical pulling so much as a subconscious need to go back and let them in. I got to my room, covered up the window, locked the door, and sat there in the dim light of the nightlight. I heard her call back to me once more, and then quiet. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I haven't slept right since. I know from reading about them that BEKs can't just come in without permission. I know they haven't hurt anyone, but I still fear I'll be the exception. When I told my husband, he said it was just a dream. He keeps telling me to forget about it, but this lingering feeling of sadness, this dread when the house is silent at night, and the fear of the knock at the door tells me otherwise. So that was another encounter that somebody had with a black-eyed kid, and I don't think I've mentioned it, but people kind of shorten black-eyed kids and just say BEKs. So that was in there, and I don't think I mentioned it before now. But this one has another example of what I'm talking about when I say they say the weirdest things, and it's just like, huh? Like, she's like, well, if we were going to hurt you, we would have just broken in and done it. That's not something you say to somebody to ease their nervousness about you. I swear these have to be either aliens or in some way connected to the Men in Black, and you can't change my mind. There are so many other personal encounters on the internet that you can find, and I'm only reading a few of the creepiest ones that I found. So let's see how this next encounter with a black-eyed kid goes. This is another one that I found on thoughtcatalog.com, and it's another word-for-word post from the person who actually experienced it. And this one says, quote, "Last night was like any other night. I was switching between listening to music and watching YouTube videos with one headphone in so I can hear my infant daughter if she cries, that way my wife can sleep. She goes to work at 4 a.m. at the hospital every day. When I decide to go lay down in the spare bed in the baby's room, just as I dozed off, I heard thumping coming from the front porch. Startled at first, I opened my eyes wide and scanned the room. Realizing it was most likely my cat scratching himself on the front porch, so I dozed back off. Then again, the thumping. Damn cat. I got out of bed to run him off the porch, only to see he wasn't there anymore. Now that I was up again, I wasn't the least bit tired. I figured I'll go make some tea and check Facebook while I'm up, maybe finish the web series I was watching on YouTube. A few minutes into the video, I felt the sudden urge to look up at the kitchen window. And there they were. The tops of two short-statured people's heads cresting the stairs just above my window frame. The people were just short enough to not see in the window, but I could see out. I heard no footsteps on my porch as my stomach turned, but the knock. The knock was a steady, hollow thump. The very same thump I had just blamed on my cat. Deciding it was best not to answer, I shut my laptop and crept by the door back to the baby's room. I assumed it was some people from the low-income housing across the road from me that were high or hiding from the cops. Or maybe my cousin who stays with me often and has many friends over. The last thing I needed was to try to explain to two stoners that I was trying to sleep even though it was 2 a.m. It wasn't until I got in my daughter's room that the creepiness set in. The thump had moved from the kitchen to the bedroom windows. Both windows, a room apart, thumping in perfect time. These stoners were going to wake my daughter up if I didn't run them off. Pissed off, I went out to the kitchen, unlocked and opened the door, ready to run around the side of the house and kick some little idiots' asses. And it happened then. Standing there, looking at me, were two 10 or 11-year-old boys. The feeling of dread and the smell of mold almost made me vomit. The smaller of the two spoke. "May we use your telegraph?" "Huh?" I just stared blankly at these boys, horrified of what I then realized. Their eyes were pitch black. He asked again to use my telegraph. There wasn't a sound to be heard. No crickets chirping, no dogs barking, no cars driving by, nothing. I tried to play it cool and ignore the fact that he didn't say telephone or phone or cell or anything that would have made sense in the situation, and calmly said, "I don't have service at my house, sorry." The expression on their faces turned to rage as I finished my sentence. Swiftly, I shut the door and locked it as quickly as I could, then stumbled back to protect my daughter. I picked her up from her crib and held her close. The fact that she didn't wake up freaked me out the most, but I managed to gather my senses enough to make sure that she was still breathing and warm. Everything seemed okay with her. The thumping on the window was back. I dropped to the floor, as close to the wall as I could get, and held my little girl in my arms while I wept like a child. I felt helpless and afraid. I lied there for what felt like hours and hours, crying and shaking until I heard my wife's alarm clock. The thumping stopped the instant the alarm went off, and I crept into the master bedroom with the baby. "What's wrong with you?" my wife asked. "I just had a bad dream," is all I could mutter out. "Okay, well, give me the baby so I can feed her before work." I handed my wife the baby and she fed her like any normal day. I turned on every light in the house and made coffee for her. For some reason, just having her awake calmed my nerves enough to pretend like nothing had happened. I walked her out to her car nervously with the baby in my arms, and I asked her not to leave until I walked back into the house. She was put off by my request, but she did so to humor me. Once I was safely in the house, I locked the doors again, and in the house I sat horrified until she got home. I insisted we go to the next town over and stay the weekend at my brother's house. And here I sit horrified while she sleeps in the guest room with my daughter, wondering why the thumping stopped when the alarm went off. I think I know the answer. I was aware of BEKs. She wasn't. Every story I've read about them is from someone who already knew about them. Maybe, just maybe, knowledge of them existing is the only reason they visit. I'm afraid, and I'm sorry. End quote. So, this guy is either a really good writer and actor, or he's actually mortified and this actually happened. And his theory is kind of that the black-eyed kids only visit people who already know about them and know that they exist, which does seem to kind of be a running theme in most of these stories, but not all of them. Some of the people who've had experiences with black-eyed kids did already know about them, but others had never even heard of them until they've had their own encounter. So here's another first-hand account of an experience with black-eyed kids. And this one says, quote, "This is so funny. I'd never heard of BEKs before my incident, so I came on here to post my story, and the first story I see is about BEKs. Weird. Let me preface this by saying I'm by no means a writer, just a domestic engineer living in North Texas. Also, I don't believe in the paranormal, ghosts, demons, aliens, whatever. However, I did have an event happen to me this Halloween, and I have to admit, it has me scratching my head. This is my first post on Reddit, and sorry to say I'd never even heard of it until yesterday. I told my best friend about this incident, and she's an avid reader of No Sleep, and she told me if I didn't post it that she would. So here I am. Anyways, I hope you like. So it had been a slow trick-or-treat night in our neighborhood that evening, which is pretty odd in itself. We usually have kids from different areas dropped off in ours and have constant parades at our door. That night, I'd say we had no more than 8 or 10 groups of kids come by the entire night. It was about 9:30, and my husband and I were sitting out in the family room watching some of those ghost shows based on supposedly actual events. Like I said, I don't believe in that stuff, but I do like a good ghost story now and then, and it was Halloween after all. We hadn't had any activity at the door in over a half an hour, and it was getting late, so we decided to turn the porch light off and let our dog Chloe out of her crate. Chloe is an American bulldog and very docile. We only put her in her crate because we're afraid she'd try to get out and play with all the kids, and I didn't want to have to chase after her down the street. Also, we didn't want her to scare any of the kids because she would look a little intimidating to the younger kids. So I turned the outside light off, let Chloe out, and she followed me back to the couch and laid down on my feet. It was getting close to 10 p.m. when my husband decided he'd had enough fun for the night and was going upstairs to take a shower and to get ready for bed. After all, it was Thursday and he still had to get up early the next day. My teenage son was out with his friends at a local haunted house and wasn't expected back for another hour or so. So that left me alone on the couch with Chloe. Now, just because I don't believe doesn't mean these shows don't freak me out a bit, and being alone now watching it, I'd have to say I was kind of on edge, as it were. It wasn't long after I heard the upstairs water for the shower turn on when there came a light knock, knock, knock at the front door. My initial reaction was, what the hell, really? It's almost 10, go home. But soon an uneasy feeling came over me. Why the knock? Our doorbell glows in the dark, and without the porch light, it would be extra obvious to anyone there. I paused. I couldn't really just ignore it. Our front door has a big beveled glass panel, and anybody right out the door could see in enough to see that someone was sitting in the family room watching TV. It would be pretty rude of me to just sit there and not answer it. Knock, 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 again from the door. I glanced down at Chloe, and she was gone. My gaze followed her usual path to the front door, expecting her to be on her way there as she normally does. Nothing. She wasn't there. I stood up to look around the room and found her, crouching by the back door like she was wanting out. However, she'd never asked to go out like this. She always comes and licks my hand and puts her head on my knee, and this was totally out of character for her, and I have to say, heightened my anxiety. "Chloe, crate," I said. She just turned back to look at me like, "Hell no, lady, I ain't moving." I yell up to my husband, but if he was already in the shower, I knew there was no chance of him hearing me. Knock, knock, knock. About that time, a car drove down our street and cast just enough light on the door to where I could see the silhouette of 2 small children through the glass. I instantly felt relief. It was just some kids. Probably a couple of my neighbors on their way back home that wanted to stop by and show me their costumes or something. I headed to the door and looked back to make sure Chloe wasn't going to follow. What a great watchdog, I thought to myself as she just sat there. I turned on the porch light when I got to the door, and sure enough, I could see through the glass that it was a couple of pretty small kids. A little late for such young ones, I thought, and I began to wonder what kind of parent would let their kids run the streets this late at night. I only opened the door enough to where I could block Chloe's escape if she decided to grow some balls, which was only about 2 feet. What struck me immediately as odd was the kids weren't wearing any costumes. They were in normal street clothes. Also, no customary trick-or-treat either. I began to feel very uneasy again. It was a girl and a boy. The girl to my left was older. I'd say about 11 or 12. I could tell she was blonde, but I couldn't make out any distinct features, as our lights are from high above and on columns of the front porch, so most of the light was coming from behind them. I hadn't opened the door wide enough for any light from inside to hit them directly. The boy was younger and about a foot shorter, I'd say 8 or 9, and looked to have light brown hair. The girl very politely spoke. "Ma'am, can we please come inside and use your phone to call our mom?" As she spoke, something in the pit of my stomach was telling me something was wrong. What kid, even at that age, doesn't have a cell phone of their own these days? I couldn't remember the last time I'd had anybody ask to use my home phone. Hun? Don't you have a phone of your own you can call your mom on, I asked? This was when things got really weird. Both kids turned to look at one another like they were going to say something to one another, but neither one of them ever spoke. They both turned back to me, and the girl said, "Ma'am, my cell phone battery doesn't have any charge left in it. Can we please come inside and call our mom? We're alone out here, and my brother is scared." I have to admit, there were 2 compelling feelings going on inside of me. The first, that of a mother's heart that wanted to help these 2 small children to get to their mother. The other, a sinking fear in my gut that was keeping the other feeling at bay. It was then that I noticed that during the short conversation, I'd already opened the door a few extra inches, which I was completely unaware of doing. I stopped. "Honey, why don't you give me your mother's number and I can call her myself?" Another pause, and they again looked at one another. After a short moment, they turned back to me and the girl said, "Ma'am, my little brother has to use your bathroom. Can we please come inside while you call our mom?" And with that last statement, the little girl moved closer toward the door like she was just going to walk in on by me. As she did, she stepped into the light coming from inside the house, and I got my first real good look at her. Solid, jet black eyes. That's all I could see. The motherly instinct was gone and replaced by terror that I don't think I've ever felt in my life. I could feel every hair on my arms and on the back of my neck standing to attention. I closed the door to where just my face was able to stick out. The little girl stopped and again pleaded, "Please, ma'am, we're really scared and alone out here. We have to come inside. Please help us." Then, like on cue, both kids began to whimper and cry. That's when the fear took over and I shut and locked the door. "I'll call your mom if you give me the number," I shouted through the door, "but I'm not letting you in my house." I could see them stand there on the porch just staring at me through the beveled glass. Part of me wanted to run upstairs to get my husband, but the bigger part of me didn't want to lose track of where they were. That would have freaked me out even more to not know where they were. After what seemed like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, I decided to call my neighbor that lived across the street. As I made my way to the side table by our couch to my phone, I glanced at the back door. Chloe was nowhere to be found. We later found her in the guest room under the bed. When I got to the phone and started to look for his contact info, it was only then that the kids stepped away from the door and began to walk to the street. As they did, I walked to the door to get a better look to see where they went, still not calling my neighbor. If you get close enough to the glass, you can see out enough to make out people's shapes, but you can't see much detail. Of course, standing that close to the door would make you pretty obvious to anyone standing outside looking in. From the door, I could see that the kids were still standing under the street lamp nearest to my house, staring at me. As I lifted the phone to my ear calling, only then did the kids start walking down our street. I met my neighbor under the street lamp once he was out there, but the kids were nowhere to be seen. Like I said, I don't believe in any of this stuff and had never even heard about black-eyed kids before talking to my friend. What I really think, or what I have to think, is that these kids were just out yanking people's chains on Halloween night. But I will say this for them. They were good. Really good at it. And they scared the shit out of me and my dog. End quote. So this lady experienced this and she still doesn't believe it was actually black-eyed kids, which I could see some kids that have like weird-ass dark parents like myself knowing about black-eyed kids and wanting to get some solid black contacts and like walking up to people's doors and scaring the shit out of them for Halloween. But who really knows? So all of the encounters we've read through so far have been people having a gut feeling that they needed to refuse help to these kids. And for whatever reason, they feel like they need to turn what seems to be children down, which isn't normal. An adult's first reaction is to help kids in need. So usually we don't feel the need or even the uncontrollable urge to help kids that need it. So this next encounter is a couple that did let the black-eyed kids inside of their house, and let's see how that turned out for them. So this encounter goes like this. Quote, I live outside of a rural town in Vermont. It's a tight-knit community where everyone knows one another, and people don't lock their doors at night. There was never a need to. A little over a year ago, I woke up because I heard a loud banging on my front door. At the time, my husband and I lived in a small home on a dirt road just off the route into town. It was the middle of a snowstorm, and the nearby hills had gotten very slippery, so I thought that maybe someone had been in an accident and broken down. It's happened before. When I looked out the window, I could see that our motion spotlight was on. I could see that there were footprints in the snow that had come from our road and into our driveway, but there was no car anywhere. The snow was still covering the road, and no one had driven down it for at least a couple hours. Our front door was obscured from the window, but I could see that someone was standing there. I wasn't sure what to think, so I woke my husband up just to feel safer. While I was telling him what was going on, the banging on the door started again, and my husband went down to answer it while I stood in the hallway. When he opened the door, there were two children standing in the snow looking at the ground. There was a boy and a girl. They couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They were dressed strangely and had odd haircuts. The girl's hair was very long and straight, and the boy had a dated haircut that looked almost like a bowl cut. They weren't dressed for the winter, and my first thought was that it must have been Mennonite children. But as far as I know, there wasn't a large community of Mennonites near us. Thinking back on it now, my normal reaction to seeing children in the snowstorm would have been to rush them inside, bundle them up with some blankets and some hot cocoa. But that's not how I felt. The children were very unnerving. They would not make eye contact when my husband asked them if everything was okay, and they asked if they could come inside. My husband looked at me like, what do I do? And I asked the kids where their parents were. They'll be here soon, is all they said. And it was around 2 a.m. at this point, so the only reasonable thought in my head was there must have been an accident and these kids got lost. As much as my instincts told me not to bring these kids inside, I did anyways. I went to the kitchen to make the kids some hot cocoa while my husband took them into the living room. While I was fixing the kettle, I could hear my husband talking to the kids. He was asking them if they were okay, where they came from, how far they'd walked, and if their parents' car was broken down. Just general things like that. But they always answered, no matter what, in unison. Our parents will be here soon. They spoke in a very sing-song voice, and they weren't afraid to be inside of a stranger's home at all. I started to notice that our cats, we had 4 of them, were hiding. Normally our cats were very curious and friendly, and we have to be careful that they don't run out the door when we leave. This time, none of them even tried to see who was there, which we thought was very strange. I found one of my cats, and all of their hair on the back of his neck was standing up, and his tail was puffed higher than I'd ever seen it before. When I bent down to pet him to see what was wrong, he hissed and started growling and backing up until he hid himself under the kitchen island. And I'd also never seen him do that before. When I walked back into the living room, the kids were sitting on the couch as still as they could be, but my husband was holding his head in his hands. I asked him what was wrong, and he just said he felt dizzy all of a sudden and that he was fine. I turned back to the children to give them the hot cocoa, but when they looked up at me, I gasped. It took everything inside of me not to drop the mugs and run away. When they looked at me with their eyes, They were completely black. When they saw that I was scared, they stood up and asked if they could use the restroom. I tried to compose myself and showed them down the hallway to the restroom. They went into the bathroom together, and I hurried back to my husband to ask if he'd seen their eyes. He said that he'd seen their eyes too, and that it looked like his brother's bruised eyes after a car accident. We were in the middle of talking about whose children they could be when my husband's nose started to bleed. He had never had nosebleeds for as long as I'd known him. I just knew inside myself that this had something to do with the kids in our bathroom. And I just started crying while I went to get my husband some tissues. That's when the power went out. I heard my husband yell my name from the living room. I went to go to him in the other room, but stopped dead in my tracks. The children were standing at the end of our hallway, and they weren't moving at all. I have never been so scared in my whole life. They just stood there in the dark for what felt like an eternity. That's when the boy said, "Our parents are here," and they walked to the door, opened it, walked out, leaving the door wide open behind them. My husband jumped up to close the door and almost fell over. We looked out the window and saw two men standing by a black car idling at the end of the driveway. The men looked like they were wearing black suits, and they were very tall, at least 6 feet tall. When my husband waved at them, they just stared at us, got into the car, and drove off. So, do the men in black have something to do with black-eyed kids? Or are the men in black completely irrelevant, and this is just a big coincidence? This is literally the only story that I could find where somebody actually let the black-eyed kids in, and although the power went out and the husband's nose started to bleed, that seems like the only thing that happened. I did find in a few places that I couldn't really confirm either way is that this couple got diagnosed with cancer not long after this. But I think that is all that I have for you this week, and I'll leave you with a few pieces of advice before I sign off. The next time you're in your car alone at night, in a dimly lit parking lot, and you hear knocking on your window, just drive off. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, do not do anything except drive off. Even if it looks like it's 2 or 3 young kids that you're leaving in a cloud of dust, because they may look innocent and childlike, but they could very well be black-eyed kids, and no one knows what they want, or if they're human, or what their end game is. And if you're home alone and it's late and dark out and you hear a familiar knocking on your door, only to look out and see someone, or better yet, something that resembles a child, just don't answer. And whatever you do, if you run across them, never let them inside. Beware of your surroundings and beware of the legend of the black-eyed kids. Dun, dun, dun. I really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed researching it and recording it. And I figured after the last 2 weeks that we could all use something a little spooky over murder. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a few minutes to rate it 1 out of 5 stars on Spotify. And if you're listening on Apple, please take a minute to leave a 1 out of 5 star rating there. You can also leave a review. It doesn't need to be long. It doesn't need to be detailed. It just makes my day every single time I get a new review on Apple. And it also helps people who are thinking about giving the podcast a listen to know what others think about it. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at murdered_mama for pictures and updates on the cases that I cover. You can also find me on Facebook by searching Mama Murdered a Podcast. All of my social media handles are listed in the show notes under the description of each episode. And I think that's all that I'm supposed to remember to say. So, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.